The conversation with Tony Campolo continues, talking about red letter Christians. Last conversation, Tony, you talked about the lack of balance in the evangelical world in terms of what it reads. Most of us are into the letters of Paul. We don't read the Gospels enough, whereas a lot of the Roman Catholic traditions and maybe some of the mainline traditions read more of the Gospels than the letters of Paul. When I was pastoring in Jerusalem years ago, I remember one of my rabbi friends saying that, Jim, you Christians essentially are the product of the Apostle Paul's theology. He said if you had listened more to Jesus, you might not be what you are today, or it might not be what you were in history as regards to relationship with the Jews. You think he's onto something, or is that a bit of an overstatement?
Well, not only is he onto something, but there's a new generation emerging in America. Red letter Christianity was created primarily because I'm somebody, and those who work with me are people who are trying to relate to the university students.
Right.
University students are not into Pauline theology. They love Jesus. They want to talk about Jesus. And the reality is that they are turning away from the church. Interestingly enough, every study done by the Pew Foundation, which does research on all these things, says the younger generation is more spiritual than any generation in recent decades. More spiritual and less religious. They take Jesus. My son is a good example. He has a Bible study with about 50 people on it. He doesn't call it a church. He says, if I call it a church, nobody will come in this neighborhood where I live, in the slums of Cincinnati. And they study the words of Jesus and what Jesus calls them to do, and how Jesus calls them to act, and how Jesus calls them to love each other. And they focus on that. Young people are fascinated with the lifestyle that Jesus has prescribed. Let me just say, one of my students at Eastern University, where I teach, Shane Claiborne, and he still operates out of my office, at least for the next few weeks anyway. Shane has become a kind of folk hero because he just takes the words of Jesus very literally. I mean, what do you do with a Jesus who says to people like me, you got a lot of money, Campolo. I want you to know something. It's going to be harder for a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Whoa. What does this say to all the rich people in Canada and in the United States? Once again, there's nothing wrong with earning $1 million a year. There is something wrong with keeping that money while you live in a world of suffering and in need. Jesus expects you to take care of yourself and your own family. But are we meeting our needs with what we earn, or are we satisfying artificially created wants? Wants that are generated by the media. The media is constantly manipulating us into buying stuff we don't need. If you don't believe me, think of Christmas. Your biggest problem is not, where am I going to get money for presents? Your biggest problem is, what do I buy for people who have
everything?
And the answer should be nothing.
Yeah.
But you haven't got the guts to pull it off. You won't come down Christmas morning and say, nobody's getting anything because everybody's got everything. No, you will go out to the bay and you'll walk up and down the aisles, and if you're Christian, you'll pray that somebody from last year invented something that nobody needs so you can give it to the person that has everything. And Jesus says, this is the foolishness of the world. Are we called to another lifestyle? Does Jesus ask us to be different from the world? And to what degree is the lifestyle of the typical Christian any different than the lifestyle of the non-Christian? Oh, we don't use certain words in our language, and we go to church on Sunday, but basically we drive the same cars, we live the same affluent lifestyle, we selfishly live to meet our own individualistic needs, and we're somewhat indifferent to the sufferings of the world.
When you look at the world, and you have seen most of it, can you think of some examples of red letter Christianity in action? People who perhaps don't know the term, maybe have never read your books or heard from you or any of your students, but in action, they actually are doing it.
Yes. As a matter of fact, we not only know that there are people who are doing it, We are actually rounding them up. There are 40-plus young men and women that come together. We bring them together every year for 3 days. We call it the Red Letter Fellowship, to talk about how are we going to implement the teachings of Jesus in the world in which we live. We hold firmly to the doctrines of the Apostle Paul. But what about this lifestyle that Jesus prescribes? The Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor, it says in Luke, the 7th chapter. No, in Matthew it says poor in spirit. Luke it says, blessed are the poor. And in case you missed it, the next part of the verse is, woe unto you who are rich. Do you see? How do you live that out? How do you do that in a way that is not crazy and squandering the resources of God? But how do you live sacrificially to meet the needs of others?
Now, somebody's listening to you right now and they're wealthy. Should they feel guilty about being wealthy?
Sure they should.
And what should they do about it?
They should be sitting down like Bill Gates has done, and he's not a Christian per se, at least he hasn't said he is publicly, and Warren Buffett, who may be a Christian, probably is, and say, okay, I got this money. Jesus, if you had this money, how would you spend it? Just what would you do with this money? I mean, I got an income, I got $1,000 a week income. How much of this does he want me to spend on paying my rent and paying the electric bill and the heat bill? And okay, what do I do with what's left? And how do I use that in ways that people will see the way in which I am spending my money, and this is from the Sermon on the Mount, and glorify the Father who is in heaven, saying, God, you really did a wonderful job with Charlie Smith. Look at the way he's spending his money. Look at the way he's using his money. That's what people are now saying about Bill Gates, and he doesn't claim to be a Christian.
One of the red letters refers to the love of money.
Yeah.
It doesn't say money. I would assume money is morally neutral, but the love of money is the root of all evil.
Yeah. I don't know whether you saw the film or saw the musical My Fair Lady.
Yeah.
But the old guy there in the movie, it sings I'm Getting Married in the Morning. Right. And this guy who had been a member of the working class and hated the bourgeoisie is one of them.
Right.
And they say, and he talks about the horrors of what money has done to him and has messed up his head. And they said, well, why don't you give it away? And he says, that's the problem. Once you got it, you can't give it away. Yeah. Whoa. Yeah. Whoa. I see that in the evangelical community in the United States. They are so afraid that their money's going to be taken from them and used on poor people. They don't mind using it for the military, which is weird. 40% of the taxpayer dollar in the United States is spent on the military. Iraq alone it costs the American taxpayer, just Iraq, $250,000 a minute. Does that blow your mind? See? Now, is that how Jesus will want a nation to use its resources? You have to begin to ask those questions, and you have to ask it on a personal level. What am I going to do with this money that's in my hands? It belongs to Jesus. Am I going to use it as if I'm going to wear that little WWJD pin? It's not only what would Jesus do, I think it's what would Jesus drive? Right. Would he buy a luxury car? My wife says my husband has a sports jacket for every day of the week. He's wearing it. I think that's a good question. If you have two coats, why don't you give one of them away? That's what Jesus says to do, doesn't he? So yeah, I think it's wonderful when people earn a lot of money. I think it's really Christian when they get the money, they say, how can I use this as Jesus wants it to be used? He wants me to take care of my family. He wants me to meet the needs that my family has for education, for clothing, for housing. But after needs are met, there's a lot left over. How does Jesus want it spent?
Now, when it comes to the question, what would Jesus do? I think one of the challenges we have is the challenge of hermeneutics, of interpretation. My interpretation of what Jesus would do might not be what your interpretation would be of what Jesus would do. Do you trust your own subjective sense of what Jesus would do, or is there some kind of objective guide?
I love Mark Twain, who said, it's not the things that Jesus said that I don't understand that bother me. It's the things that I do understand. I don't know that there's much leeway when Jesus says it's harder for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. before I went to graduate school to study sociology, I went through seminary because I wanted to integrate sociology with my faith. So I took a lot of theology. And I'm glad I went to seminary because until I went to seminary, I kind of thought Jesus meant what he said. You know, Jesus said to the rich young ruler, you want to be my disciple? Sell what you have and give it to the poor. Before I went to seminary, I thought that what Jesus meant was, if you want to be his disciple, you should sell what you have and give it to the poor. But when I went to seminary, they said, that's what Jesus said. But what he really meant was, and that's what seminary was. Seminary was a whole process where they took the obvious words of Jesus and said he really didn't mean it. Whoa, maybe Jesus did mean what he said, and maybe he said what he meant. I think it's pretty clear when he says love your enemies. As I said earlier today, when he said love your enemies, he probably meant we shouldn't kill them. I think that's a fair statement. You know, so you know, we can argue over the theology of Paul. The thing that I love about Jesus is that whether Gandhi is reading Jesus, whether Bonhoeffer is reading Jesus, we all pretty much read him the same way. He spoke with such clarity. And I remember sitting in class saying about the professor, who is this sucker up there who acts like Jesus was such a lousy communicator, he couldn't make himself clear. And I had to go to seminary to figure out what he really meant. Come on.
I know you're enjoying this. There's a lot more coming tomorrow. You want this Red Letters DVD offer for sure. Here's how you can get it.